Hi, and welcome to the fourth video of my video series on my PhD research in South Shore. My name is Tillman, and in this video I am talking about residents' experiences with the newspaper discourse that I have described in video number 1. So this is the first video of the second part of this video series where I talk about how residents perceive everyday life and how they portrayed everyday life in South Shore through their stories and what they had to tell me during our conversations. And one topic that was very important to many of those to whom I spoke is this experience of newspapers or the news media more broadly in how they talk about South Shore. So community residents repetitively talked about the negative image that South Shore receives through news media reporting. And in this video, I am reflecting on that and tell you a little bit about how community residents talked about that. So you will see that I will use a lot of direct quotes from conversations that I had with community residents, so I let community voices speak much more in comparison to the other first 3 videos that I produced. So what was very important from the beginning for me when I talked to community residents was to ask them, so how do you perceive the news media when they report on South Shore? And across the board of the 37 interviews that I conducted with community residents in South Shore, people perceive the news media as being negative, as being stereotyping the community as a violent space. So this feeling of stigma and the stigmatization by the news media was a very important topic. And I want to quote one community resident, I think, which captures really well this feeling of stigma. And the person said, it became a situation where the media was changing our image of ourselves. I think this is a great way in how community residents perceived news media reporting on South Shore. So to give you some more quotes from community residents and how they talked about the news media representing South Shore, here I'm going to read out some quotes that I think are interesting to see. So one person said, every day you would open up the paper or hear on the news someone got killed. You only hear about violence in South Shore. So you don't know that we have $1 million mansions in the community. You don't know that we have some of the best housing stock in the city. And another community resident said, how often do you hear about the great things that's happening? How often do you hear about the great programs that we are putting together here in the South Shore Cultural Center? How often do you hear about the great program that we take outside of this building and utilize in other areas? You don't hardly hear about it. What you hear about is crime. So reflecting on these comments, the image that South Shore receives by the news media and which is experienced by community residents is that this community is this one homogeneous space where everything is about violence and crime. So people complain to me that other things, such as the one person mentioned, community programs, or the fact that South Shore is a diverse community with regards to the housing stock. So all these things don't take place in media reporting, and residents are very aware of that. But beyond just identifying that newspapers are particularly talking about crime and violence rather than other elements of South Shore, the image and the stigma that is produced by newspapers and news media is actually hurtful to community residents. And I'm going to give you some quotes here which I think are very important and capture well how this stigma is actually emotionally stressful and distressing to some community residents. So one person said, in response to my question about how they perceive the news media most people stopped walking the streets because they too were being educated by the 10 o'clock news and by the headlines in the newspapers. Another person said newspapers darken the community so much that people really believe there's an awful neighborhood. And another person said one time we had a newspaper came to interview us. They interviewed quite a few people, but they only talked about gang violence and shooting up each other, and it hurts. So here you see that community residents really emphasize that it is emotionally hurtful to hear only about violence and crime. So that is actually distressful that newspapers, which when they come to the community, only talk about violence and crime. And for me, this was an important finding in my PhD research because it is one thing to describe how newspaper talk about a community, but it is also as much important to learn about the lived experiences of people with such media reporting. And we know from research from other areas across the world that stigmatization of communities is often emotionally very distressful, very difficult for community residents. What I found, however, very, very interesting for South Shore is that community residents to whom I spoke did not just accept that. It was never this feeling that I had that South Shore as a community or the members of South Shore would just continue to read these negative newspapers without doing anything about it. Instead, what I identified in my PhD research is that there is a lot of resistance in the community to the stigmatization. Resistance strategy, in my opinion, is that we have to rebrand the community. So here I want to give you two quotes from two residents who articulated this idea of rebranding the community. And the first one says, we need something to dispel the myth that we have some type of culture deficit, that we have some type of social deficit, that we are social. The second community voice says that when we lost the grocery store, we wanted to rebrand our neighborhood and hold the media accountable for what they say about the community. So this idea of rebranding was important to many in our conversations about the media and how it portrays South Shore. And to the extent that the community, South Shore, created its own newspaper, the South Shore Current magazine, which I interpret as a form of resistance to the mainstream media and how it was reporting on South Shore. So this magazine, in my opinion, in my interpretation, is providing a platform, an alternative to the big newspapers, for example, Chicago Tribune, Chicago Sun-Times, not so much in daily reportings on politics, but to emphasize an alternative and to create an alternative vision of South Shore as a community that in fact has a lot of culture, a lot of social activities taking place, which are not reported on in other newspapers and therefore would get lost. And this magazine, in my opinion, is also a form of resistance by providing a counter narrative to the dominant hegemonic views from the Chicago Tribune and Chicago Sun-Times or any other news media that reports on Chicago's South Side and South Shore in particular. So my question to you again is, do you agree with my findings? Do you also see in your everyday life media being important in how they portray South Shore? Do you perceive that on a daily basis? Is it something that you think about a lot? And if so, how does it impact you? And what do you think is going missing in media reporting? Are there topics that you wish to be more in the news media? What would you like to see in terms of changes? So please leave your comments below because I would be very interested again in hearing about that in more details. Thank you very much again for listening, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you.